Hi, hello. I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you today via the internet to talk about the selection and care of garden tools. We spend a lot of time out in our gardens doing all sorts of different tasks, from weeding to planting and working with our soil. And garden tools really make a lot of the tasks that we have out there a lot easier. We want to make sure both that we're selecting the garden tools that we need, that are going to do the best job for us. We also want to make sure that we're taking care of them, so the investment in those tools is going to last. So we want to make sure that we have the right tool for the job. And one of the things that I really encourage people to do when they purchase tools is to make sure that when we do buy something, that we buy a quality product. There are a lot of tools out there on the market. You can buy tools at a variety of different places, different hardware stores and big box stores. And the range of quality that's out there is pretty broad. And it's a lot better if it's particularly if it's going to be a tool that we're going to use frequently. Having a tool that's well made and is going to last is really going to save money in the long run. So it's a lot better to buy that tool once and spend a little bit of money on it, rather than needing to buy it several times because the tool's breaking. That being said, if you walked into my garden shed, you would see a lot of tools that are lying up against the wall or hanging on a hook that don't look like they've been used very much over the past several years. And that really is the case. So we want to make sure when we're buying tools that we're actually buying the ones that we're going to use. The most of the tools that we are going to use in the garden have been around for a long time. They've been designed for a really good purpose, and they're well designed for that. So it's probably best to let some of the kind of gimmicky things that you might see come past you, just sit on the store shelves and just purchase the tools that you're going to use very frequently out there in the garden. That being said, you do want to make sure that you're using the tool for the purpose it was designed for. That is going to make sure that that tool lasts very long time, as well as reduce the risk of injury that you might have when you're working with. One of the things that I consider really important when I am looking for a quality tool is the handle of the tool. A lot of times we get really focused on the tool end, whether it be a shovel or a rake or a spade. One of the things that I think it's really valuable to pay attention to is that handle, because that handle really is going to be a big part of whether that tool is going to last, whether it's going to be comfortable to use. So there are a lot of options that you'll see out there. And sort of the classic tool handle that you think of is going to be a wood handle. You can also find tools that have fiberglass handles. And the good thing about those fiberglass handles is that they do tend to be a lot lighter. And so they're a little bit easier to carry around. But if you're going to be putting a little bit of strain on that tool, that fiberglass can break fairly easily, and can be very difficult to replace. Kind of on the other end of things, you can buy tools that have a tube steel handle. These are incredibly sturdy. They are going to last functionally forever, but they are extraordinarily heavy and can make your garden tasks a lot more unpleasant, just because you're having to shift around all of that weight for that big, heavy tube steel handle. My preference is very strongly towards wood handles. They last a very long time. I keep my grandfather's axe out in my garden shed. It has had a new wood handle put on it several times over the years, but it has lasted a very, very long time, and is still a functional and perfectly attractive tool today. One thing you want to pay attention to when you look at a wooden handle is you want to pay attention to the grain of the wood. Not all wood is going to be created equal, and you really want to have a wood that is going to have a tight grain. That is going to be somewhat heavier, but it's going to make for a much sturdier tool. And if you go and you find some cheap tools, the sort of the bargain basement end of things, often they do have wood handles, but you can see the grain on that wood is very far apart, and because of that, the wood is much weaker. So making sure you've got a good wood handle, a really nice tight grain, is going to work well for you. I think those work well. They don't transmit vibration as much as you might see in a fiberglass handle or in a tube steel handle. And I just think they last a long time if they're properly cared for. And they really do represent, in my mind, the best option for tool handles. Now, there are a lot of tools out there, and I'd like to mention some, talk a little bit about how they should be used, and just kind of discuss what I consider some of the essential tools for home landscape. Probably the first one is going to be a spade. This is going to be really an essential tool for digging holes or planting trees, shrubs, even large flowers. It can also be used for edging flower beds. You can shovel small quantities of material, but it's not really what it's designed for. And you can see that the end of that spade has either a flat surface or a really very minor curve to it. That really makes it useful for digging a hole very well or for edging. And if you maintain it properly, you can get through the roots of small trees before digging them up. One thing that people don't pay much mind to, that I really think they should, is to make sure that they keep a really good edge on that spade. We don't often think about sharpening our spades or sharpening our shovels, but that really does make the work that we have with them go a lot easier. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sharpening as we get further on in the presentation. One thing you do want to pay attention to is the length of that handle. You want to make sure that it's going to be a comfortable length for you. Short-handled spades are fine if you're not going to be doing any heavy work with them, but a long handle is going to give you some leverage. You just don't want it to be longer than you're going to be able to comfortably work with. You can also find spades in all sorts of different blade lengths. Usually a length of about 9 inches works really well for most gardeners. Prevents it from being too long and kind of being unwieldy, or being too short and therefore just not really an easy tool to use in the home landscape. The complement to a spade is the shovel. The shovel is not really so much a tool for digging as it is for shifting materials, things like dirt and soil, even gravel or compost. There are many different varieties of shovels out there. I think that most home gardeners really need two. You can see the two images there. One for kind of heavier materials you're going to be moving less of, and then that large, usually aluminum shovel that you're going to be using for lighter materials. Again, you can find those with long or short handles. You can find a blade made of steel or stainless steel or aluminum. For those larger shovels where you're looking at light materials, an aluminum blade is just fine. Other than that, you really want to go with a good steel blade on that. And again, having that point, if you're going to be digging into a pile, works really well. Or if you're going to be shifting things off the ground, having that flat surface really makes things a lot easier. The other thing we definitely need, or another thing we definitely need, is a lawn rake. They are, of course, that's the tool for raking up leaves or other debris into a pile. You can get moss or leaves off of the lawn surface, gather up material, or move mulch around underneath trees. These tools really aren't designed for lifting materials. I have seen varieties of rakes where they have a little lever on them to close the head together. I don't think very much of those. They wind up breaking very quickly. And this is a tool where you're going to see a wide variety of tool quality, ranging from the sort of plastic rakes that tend to break fairly quickly. If you can find one of the older style ones that still have the metal heads on them, they tend to last a very long time and be really useful throughout that life. Kind of similar in idea is a garden fork. There are two different kinds of garden fork. You can see here a digging fork and a lifting fork. The difference really is in the number of tines they have on them. A digging fork will generally tend to have fewer tines, and a lot of times we're trying to move around or dig into soil that has a lot of stone or a lot of rocks in it. It can be really difficult to get a spade in, and the purpose of this tool really is to just break up that material and make it easier for us to come back with a spade and shift it. That lifting fork is going to be used for what we're not using that rake for, which is lifting up hedge clippings or grass and weeds to get that to and from wherever, to a wheelbarrow or other thing we're going to be shifting it into. Really important tool in the home landscape are hedge clippers. These are going to be used to help us maintain the desired shape of our landscape plants. One of the three important tools we need for pruning. They're, of course, the classic manual hedge clippers always have a place in our home landscape. The pair I use have telescoping handles on them that make them a little bit more convenient to use. And of course, you can use gas-powered or electric-powered hedge clippers. The thing that I'll tell people about those is I think that they're really good for sort of the rough work. If you really need to knock the size of a hedge back or knock the size of a shrub back, using those automatic or gas-powered or electric clippers works very well. But when you really want to get in there and shape that plant and make sure that you've got good clean cuts, I don't think that there really is a replacement for those manual clippers. It is very easy to let those gas-powered ones get away from you, and that can lead to all sorts of injury on the plant. So we tend to do our broad work with one of the powered ones, and then come back with our manual hedge clippers in order to do that finer work. And again, there's another note there to make sure that we're sharpening those frequently. And oftentimes we remember to do that with our manual tools, but we forget to do that with our gas-powered ones or electric-powered ones. So regardless of whether it's manual or not, you do need to make sure that we're sharpening that tool fairly often. Another of the very important tools we need for pruning in the home landscape, this is a standard pair of pruning shears. You can see there the fancy word for them that's used in the United Kingdom or secateurs. And this is really going to do the vast majority of your pruning. You just don't want to cut any material with it that's over about 3/8 of an inch thick, both because it's a little big for the tool and it can wind up breaking it or damaging it. And also, once you get up to about that size, you can wind up getting a poor cut, tear the bark a little bit, and that's just not good. When we get up to that size of a cut, we really need to go back to those hedge clippers to use those as opposed to a set of pruning shears. Again, you want to make sure they are really sharp. I keep several pairs of these around as just to make sure that I'm keeping them well maintained. Some things to really look for on these. It's a good idea to make sure you get a set that's easy to take apart, that you can just take a screwdriver to and take it apart so you can really easily sharpen that blade. Another thing, particularly as we're getting older, it starts to get a little bit hard to use these, particularly as we get up to some larger size branches. And there are some ratcheted models of these where you can squeeze the handle several times and to make a really good clean cut. And that really does make it a lot easier to get really clean cuts on those branches. The last of our cutting materials is a good pair of lopping. Well, the second to last of our cutting materials is going to be a good set of lopping shears. These are good for branches up to about 1.5 inches. Again, good long handles, often telescopic handles if you can get them. You want to make sure when you cut with these that it cuts diagonally on the stem so that we have a good clean cut, puts less strain on the blade, and it's just going to require a lot less effort than trying to cut along the blade of the wood. Again, telescopic handles will give you a little bit more reach with it, and similar to the pair of pruning shears, there are ratcheted versions of these that allow you to kind of continually push those handles together and get a good clean cut on your branch. The last of our cutting equipment, this is going to be a bow saw or a pruning saw. Once we start getting up to branches that are about 1.5 inches or bigger, this is the best tool for us to use. It's really simple, sort of one-handled saw. Just cuts really well. And the trick to using these properly is to make sure that we use that 3-cut method in order to avoid any injury to the tree. You can see that kind of detailed there on the slide, where you make that first cut going upward several inches out from the branch collar. Make that cut upwards, and what that does is it just takes the weight off of the branch collar. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the length of that branch. Again, that's just removing that weight. And then for our third and final cut, we go back to that branch collar, make a really good clean cut right outside of that to avoid any injury to the trunk of the tree. Getting away from our cutting tools, probably one of the most common things we are going to use in the home landscape is going to be a water hose. There are all sorts of these out there, and really a lot of variety in how much they cost. And you will see them classified as being light duty or medium duty or heavy duty. I have simply stopped buying anything other than heavy duty hoses because those light duty hoses tend to break down very quickly in the landscape. They're out in the sun and out in the wind and rain, particularly today. So we want to make sure that they're going to be able to last. And so, I would advise you at least buy a medium use hose for gardening, just to avoid replacing them frequently. The other thing that we can do just to make sure that we're maintaining our hoses is to make sure we keep them rolled up, keep them from laying out in the landscape where it's easy to run over them, or just get them broken some other way. So keeping them rolled up right there by the water source is about the best thing we can do to take care of them. Oftentimes we do put heads on these. And I used to have a really bad habit of leaving the water on and just using the hose as a way to, or using the head as a way to shut off the water. And that just keeps water pressure in that hose constantly. And that can, again, cause that hose to break down fairly quickly. So when you store your hose, it's a good idea to make sure you've turned off the water or run the water out of it. Just to kind of keep the pressure off of it and make that hose last a good bit longer. One of the things I found particularly, I worked at a zoo for a while, and there were critters around occasionally, and if you kept water in the water hoses, they would wind up chewing through the water hoses to get at that water. The other end of that would be the hose nozzle or the hose head. Ideally, these have multiple spray options for all sorts of different uses in the landscape. Most of the time we wind up using a hollow cone spray, but you want different applications where you can mist plants or just have one straight spray if you wanted to knock something off a plant. That works really well. Oftentimes when you find cheap versions of these, they have plastic fittings. Those tend to break down relatively quickly, just as a response to differences in temperature and differences in humidity. So finding ones that have brass or metal fittings are going to lead to you having a hose nozzle that's going to last a lot longer, be a lot more value for your money. One of the things that very frequently goes wrong with these and is easy to fix are the O-rings, the fittings where they connect to the hose. It's just a little ring of plastic that creates a seal when you screw this onto the hose. Check those. They do tend to get worn or dry rotted. So those are relatively easy to replace and extremely inexpensive and allow you to keep your hose nozzle working. It's just a much cheaper part to replace. One of the things I have found and fallen a little bit in love with over the past few years, you can see up at the top there that sort of a classic trigger style where you hold that trigger down in order to adjust the flow rate of the water. That tends to, if you're watering quite a few plants out in the home landscape, tend to get a little bothersome. So they have versions of hose nozzles that have kind of a fireman style regulator on them, where you can take that handle that's located up at the top and move that in order to regulate the amount of water coming out. And you don't have to constantly put pressure on it to do that. And I find those to be a lot more convenient to use, a lot easier to really regulate the pressure on, and just winds up making your hand not get tired nearly as quickly. Another important tool we need to have out in the home landscape is a cultivator. There are all sorts of these. The classic one is that little 3-tined cultivator that you see there. Often you'll see a version of this that may have a sort of spade-like attachment on the back of it. Really work very easily as a way to just turn up the soil or weed really closely to plants, or even incorporate fertilizers into the soil, other materials into the soil as we're working with it. I enjoy the use of those 3-tine cultivators. The larger cultivator that you see there, where it has those sort of interlocking rings on it, I have never found to be a particularly useful tool in the home landscape. They tend to be very difficult to work with, or get material hooked up in them very quickly. So while I think they're a great idea in principle, in practice, I've not had a lot of success with. Of course, when we talk about weeding, we have to talk about our garden hoe. There are a lot of different versions of these. I'm going to mention a couple of them. It has a light blade, fairly light handle. We're using this to remove the top growth on weeds in beds and even in driveways. And what we do with a hoe, oftentimes you see, or I see when I work with young people, they'll take the hoe and it looks like they're trying to drive it down into the ground in order to dig up the weed. And that's really not what we're trying to do. What we want to do is keep that blade on that hoe really good and sharp, and just move it relatively gently across the surface of the soil and cut that weed as opposed to dragging it. And that winds up being a lot easier to work with than trying to use that hoe as a digging tool. The Warren hoe just has a different shape to it, kind of an arrowhead shape. Here at the community garden in Bay St. Louis, I have a master gardener named Warren, so we always give him this tool. It is used to weed close to plants. That shape makes it really convenient to get close in to plants that we like in the landscape and remove those small weeds around them, particularly around our flowers. And it can also be used, if we have some hard soil, having that good sharp point allows us to use that to break up that hard soil and kind of use it as a pick to break apart that clay material. Another really easy tool to use is the Scuffle or Stirrup hoe. The blade of it goes sideways there. You can see that image there. And you just use that by moving it back and forth across the surface of the soil. If you angle it right, if you've got a good handle there, you can stay completely upright while you're weeding. As I have gotten older, my back is a little bit less forgiving about leaning down all the time. So having that tool where I can stand up straight and move that across the surface of the area I'm working with makes my life a lot easier. Um, and you can see again that the long side of that triangle on that stirrup hoe is the sharp one, and that just allows, again, you to cut the weeds across the surface of the soil. And this is really good for working in rocky soil, or if you've already cultivated the soil, a really easy tool to work with. One thing I am very particular with in my gardening is the sprayer that I use. There are a lot of these that are out there and available. You can get everything from a little sort of a quart-sized sprayer that you hold just kind of in one hand, all the way up to backpack sprayers that carry 5 gallons or so. Usually the 1 or 2 gallon sprayers that you can kind of hold in one hand comfortably are the easiest to use. Once you start getting up to a 5 gallon tank, you are carrying around quite a bit of weight. So having these little 1 gallon sprayers makes it a little bit more convenient to use around the landscape. One thing to keep in mind when you purchase these is that you want to buy quality when you're buying a sprayer. You can buy very inexpensive little pump sprayers for even less than $10. They tend to have a lot of plastic parts, and in my experience, they tend to break down relatively quickly. Finding one that has a brass spray wand, I think, is a really good thing to have. They just wind up lasting a lot longer, being a lot more reliable. Now, one thing about sprayers that I do like to keep in mind is you need to wash them very thoroughly after they're used. I always make sure that I wash them before and after because you don't want any contamination. If you're spraying an insecticide, you don't want whatever you sprayed last time to have any remnant in that container because you run the risk of it getting onto the plants and potentially causing some problems. And unfortunately, I have seen a number of cases where somebody sprayed a herbicide and then forgot to clean out their sprayer tank, added an insecticide in it to get rid of some bugs that were in their garden, still had some residue of that herbicide in the tank, and caused some real harm to their garden. One thing I advise people to do, if it's something that you can do, is to actually have different sprayers for different uses. So I have a sprayer that is dedicated solely to the use for herbicides. I took a magic marker and wrote herbicide on it in big letters that I couldn't mistake. Another one for insecticides, another one for fungicides, and then another one for anything else that I might want to spray out there in the landscape. So having all those different sprayers just allows me to avoid any potential damage to my plants. Makes me feel a little bit safer about what I'm doing out there. A really useful garden tool is a Hori knife, sometimes called a soil knife or a weeding knife. The name Hori comes from the Japanese, where they say that is the sound that things make as we're digging. And if you look at the blade, On one side, it has kind of a multi-purpose little knife blade. The other side has a serrated edge for cutting. And then it's got a concave shape to it that makes it really easy to dig with. It actually has a measure on it or a ruler on it so you can see how deep you're digging. And it is a very useful tool to have to accomplish a range of different tasks in the garden. So if there is such a thing as a multi-tool for gardening, this is a really good example of that. And if you know any gardeners that you're trying to do any early Christmas shopping for, Hori and Hori knives or soil knives make wonderful gifts, and there are some really attractive ones out there. Of course, we do need a wheelbarrow. There are both steel, the sort of classic steel wheelbarrows, and the plastic wheelbarrows. Plastic wheelbarrows tend to be a lot lighter, and they tend to have a larger volume that they can carry, but they also tend to be a good bit less durable. There is something to be said for that classic metal wheelbarrow. One of the things that I often see with wheelbarrows is that they tend to get overloaded. So one thing to really pay attention to when we're using a wheelbarrow is to make sure that we're not overloading it. When you purchase it, it should have a sticker on it somewhere that gives an indication of what that maximum weight should be. And we don't want to exceed that. It can wind up damaging the wheel and make our wheelbarrow not useful anymore. Most of you're going to find are going to kind of be in that classic sort of one-wheeled triangle shape. They do have some really nice ones that have two wheels that, in my experience, have been are a lot easier to move around and keep balanced. So that might be a thing that you might want to consider. Of course, the Weedeater is a really important tool in the home landscape. Often called, you can call it a trimmer or a weed whacker or any other thing like that. We're just using that to remove weeds in between plants or on pavements or curbs. Weedeater disease is one of the more frequent things that I run into in landscapes where we get a little bit too close to the plant with our Weedeater and wind up damaging the cambium tissue or the cells that transmit water and nutrients through the plants right down there at the base of the tree. And in severe cases, we can girdle the plant, leading to death of the plant. So we want to make sure that we're being really careful with that and keeping away. And if you, of course, mulch around the base of your plants, that can give you a really good edge to avoid. Or in my case, I always put a little bit of a plastic ring down at the bottom of the plant just to make sure that I don't get too close to the plant with that Weedeater. A lot of the models that you can purchase now have interchangeable ends where you can switch it out to an edger or to a brush cutter, even into a trimmer and a leaf blower and a range of other things. So that is certainly a possibility and certainly something that I would suggest if you don't already have separate tools. And that just winds up saving you a lot of space. There are both gas and electric models available. And I used to kind of make fun of the electric versions. But really the advantage of some of the electric models, of course, you are tied to an outlet somewhere. So you want to make sure that you're going to be able to reach all the places where you're going to be using it in the landscape. But those electric models are significantly lighter than the gas models. So that is something that is worth considering. They do have some battery models now as well. And again, they're, even with the battery models, they do tend to be a good bit lighter than the gas models. So the gas models tend to be a little bit more effective or just have a little bit more power to them. I did mention that sharpening was going to be important. I mentioned with several of our tools, we need to make sure that we're paying attention and keeping them well sharpened. So all of our hose and shears and knives and loppers and everything else needs to be good and sharp when we use it. We want to make sure we're when we're doing that, we can wipe down the blade with a good lubricant. And the majority of the tools that we're using can just be filed with a 10-inch flat mill file that you can purchase at just about any hardware store. And then you file it down to a 20 to 45 degree angle. And most of them are going to come with a bevel on them that you can follow. If we're talking about one of our smaller tools, we want to put a finer edge on. If we're talking about pruners or shears, we can use a whetstone for that to finish the edge. And when I do this course in person, I actually bring my file and my whetstone and we'll let everybody bring their tools in. And if they aren't accustomed to sharpening things, then I will sit down with them and show them exactly what to do. Fortunately, that is a little bit difficult to do over the internet, but I will hopefully put up a video relatively soon on my YouTube page, just to kind of cover that and talk a little bit specifically about sharpening. If you have the opportunity, particularly for some of the larger tools, a bench grinder can be used to put that edge on really quickly. But of course, you really want to be careful with that and make sure we don't overgrind your tool. Tool maintenance is really important. Whenever you're using a tool, you want to make sure you get all of the soil off of it after each use. Usually you can do that just by hosing it off. Otherwise, you can use a screwdriver or other implement, just remove any caked or dried mud. Since we are talking about using our hose on it, we don't want to put that tool away wet. You want to make sure that you let that dry down completely before you store it. And that'll just help keep your tool away from getting rusty and prevent any rot of your handle. It is a good idea each garden season for those wooden handles to rub some linseed oil into them. That just helps preserve that wood and keep it good for years to come. And again, after every use, wipe any metal parts, any pruners or shears or loppers, anything like that, with an oily rag, or spray it lightly with a penetrating oil or something like WD-40, again, just to prevent rust on that tool. If you want a little bit of extra rust prevention, one thing you can do is just fill a 5-gallon bucket with some builder sand or play sand and pour a quart of new motor oil over it. And you can actually use this as a shovel cleaner or oiler each time you put your tools away. Just plunge the tool down into it several times. And this will work really easily as a way to clean your tools. It also works very effectively as a shovel stand. So you can just keep that bucket filled with oily sand over in the corner. And when you get done with your shovel and you've knocked your dirt off of it, you can just put it down into that sand. And that works as not only a way to keep your tool clean, but a way to keep it in a convenient location for you. It is also important to make sure that we're cleaning our tools to prevent any plant disease. We don't want to share any potential disease from location to location. So cleaning our tools after each use helps us prevent the spread of disease. Some organisms can actually stay on our tools for quite a long time if we don't clean them. And so if you're working with, particularly with our pruning tools, I always recommend cleaning them either with a bleach solution, which would be a 5% bleach solution or 1 part bleach to 19 parts water, or with a vinegar solution, which is a little bit more concentrated for the vinegar. So 1 part vinegar to 9 parts water. Either of those solutions work really well to remove any plant disease organisms that might be on the tool and prevent you from spreading disease from one plant to another. It is, of course, important to store our tools in a um, safe way and a way that is going to keep them in good shape. Unfortunately, neither of these images are taken from my garden shed, but these are good examples, so I wanted to use them. Ideally, you want to store them in a dry, well-ventilated area. Pegboards are really good for keeping tools well organized and in good condition. Anything that has a good sharp edge, you don't want to store that on the hard floor, as that will damage them. And I found just having them horizontal rather than vertical works really well. It's a lot more efficient if you have the space for it, and it helps maintain that tool over time. You can see down there at the bottom, just kind of an easy way to build a place to store tools using PVC and a little bit of backing board that works really well. Not only to keep the tools in really good condition, but also keep them easily arranged so you know where to find them. All right.